is a very great pleasure for me to chair the session and to be able to introduce Dick Langlois. It is not too often where one meets someone for the first time and it's someone whose work one has read before. And it's a very big pleasure for me for that reason. As you would have seen from your notes, Dick is a professor of economics at Connecticut University, distinguished professor of economics at Wits University, and also an adjunct professor at Copenhagen Business School, and that is in strategy and business history. He's one of those rare people who have managed to combine work both in economics and in management. And of course, that is where Austrian economics has a lot to offer. One of the things which was a very pleasant surprise for me moving to a business school is how much of a business school research touches on Austrian economics, if it's not even guided by, particularly in entrepreneurship. And Dick has done work in all of these areas. Dick, a great pleasure, and over to you.
Thank you. Well, I want to start actually by picking up on the last session, because I knew Lachmann a little bit back in the day. In fact, my experience was in some ways the mirror image of Jochen's experience, because I was a postdoc at New York University in the early 1980s. So I would see Lachmann when he came to New York, and then Jochen would see him when he was back in Johannesburg. And I don't have any great Lachmann stories except to express a great regret that my old friend Roger Koppel couldn't be here, because Roger does a fantastic Lachmann imitation. So if you wanted to hear what Lachmann sounded like, Roger's the one. Call him on the cell phone and have him do his Lachmann imitation. Oh yes, and the uptrend in the voice and the whole thing. And in some ways, Lachmann inspired this paper in the sense that when his 1986 book came out, I read it. In fact, I think I wrote a book review of it. And I was struck by this passage where he talks about product differentiation. And I've always hated I almost said neoclassical, the orthodox theory of product differentiation, wherein firms are hated because they rush to fill in all the possible things that consumers could possibly want, and that's anti-competitive to do all the things that consumers could possibly want. Whereas Lachmann makes this point that differentiation is actually part of the process of innovation, and I thought that's absolutely right. And someday I should write about this. This also speaks a little bit to some of the things people were saying about Lachmann and the telephone. This was published in 1986, right? And he says here, can anybody imagine how the aircraft, gramophones, or typewriters of 60 years ago, right, would have become the wonderful gramophones and typewriters that we have in 1986? In 1986, when I was already in Connecticut by 1986, but in 1982, I was the first person in NYU economics department to have a personal computer. At a K-Pro 2, which I still have. So I knew in 1982 that the future of typing wasn't going to evolve out of the typewriter, and I didn't quite know about gramophones yet, because DVDs weren't marketed until 1995. So we can give him a pass on that. So what I want to think about is in part differentiation. The reason I wrote this paper is kind of a one-off paper, is because I got invited to a conference at NYU back in December, and the title of the conference was Innovation from the Bottom Up. And one of the people at the conference who presented a paper was Joel Mokyr, and Joel was arguing he was trying to resuscitate the top-down model of innovation. Right? So his idea was the innovation really comes from people with sort of at the tail end of the human capital distribution, with high human capital, who face obstacles and so on. And of course, being a contrarian, I decided I was going to assert the other point of view, which was natural to me because it's sort of the point of view of my former professor, Nate Rosenberg, which is that innovation comes really in many ways comes from the bottom up. So I wanted to sort of think about the process of innovation. What does it mean for it to be top up, and what does it mean to come from the bottom? And if you're thinking about innovation from the top down, as Joel does, what you're thinking about, and what almost everybody now is thinking about when they think about innovation, is recombination, right? So you can think of that as kind of a top-down story. There's an idea over here, an idea over there. We put them together. Matt Ridley in this TED Talk and books, various things, has popularized this idea. He says innovation is ideas having sex, right? So it's sort of a top-down. It's sort of a top-down view. What I do in the paper is I say, well, look, there are some other mechanisms of innovation as well, right? There's subdivision. Instead of combining things, you can take things apart, right? You can take something that exists, and instead of recombining with something else, you can change the thing that already exists, and that was what Lachmann was talking about, right? And you can just fine-tune, right? You can do things better, do the same thing in a better way, right? And those things are not obviously recombination, although people, when I showed this paper to people who I presented at the conference, they said, oh, well, there's some recombination in all of these, even fine-tuning. And that may be true, right? And of course, if we're going to think about subdivision, we have to go back to Adam Smith. And Adam Smith had a very full theory of innovation, right? Because he said there's all these reasons why the division of labor is valuable. One is fine-tuning. Okay, so learning by doing. You do the same thing over and over again. You get better at it, right? Kind of a Malcolm Gladwell kind of story, right? 10,000 hours, and you become an outlier. You become really good at something. And there's kind of a standard economic story here, but also innovation, right? So he said if you focus on one thing, you get to know that thing very well, and you are likely to think about ways of improving it, right? So innovation might come from the person who is using it, but of course he knew more than that too. And in fact, Adam Smith understood perfectly well the idea of recombinant innovation, right? So he says, this is a wonderful passage. I won't read all of it to you, but this is one of my favorite passages from Adam Smith. He says, some innovation comes from those who are called philosophers or men of speculation, which means us, right? Whose job it is not to do anything, which we all know is true, right? Not to do anything, but to observe everything, and who, upon that account, are often capable of combining together the powers of the most distant and dissimilar objects. Would that we write like that nowadays. That's recombination, combining together the powers of the most distant and dissimilar objects. Now, what does that have to do about top-down or bottom-up? Well, if it's easy to combine together the powers of the most distant and dissimilar objects, then innovation from the top down is pretty easy. You want to focus on the people who are seeing the ideas and bringing them together, and that's the creative part, right? Seeing the ideas, bringing them together, and once they're together, that's no problem, right? And there are sometimes, I argue, when that is true. This is a picture that I've had in many things that I've published. Sanchez and Mahoney stole it from Henderson and Clark, but this is their version of it. And Paul Robertson and I had a version of this a long time ago too. What is this saying? Well, it's saying it's about the idea of modularity. Okay, and I'm not going to go heavy into modularity. That's one of my enthusiasms is modularity. But on one axis, you can see changes in the components. So think about something like, well, I'll give you an example in a minute. Right? Think about a system with different parts. The parts of the system could each change rapidly. Or along the other dimension, we could change not the parts themselves, but we could change the way things are connected together. Okay, that's architectural innovation. And if we keep the architecture pretty constant and we change only the things themselves, that's modular innovation. Or actually a better term might be module innovation, because this is really modular too, right? So what would be an example of architectural innovation? The best example in the world of architectural innovation is Legos, right? Because what are Legos? Legos are modules, but it's not modular innovation because the Legos don't change. They're always the same. You might paint a little mustache on one or make it look like Batman or something. But they're basically all the same, right? But you can make anything out of Legos, right? So that's down here. So Legos are kind of down here in the diagram. Up here in the diagram, you've got something like personal computers, where you've got a standard set of interfaces, but the modules change. So your video card can get better without the architecture changing, right? Your monitor can get better without the architecture changing. Your processors get better. That's modular innovation. The problem is, and that's so what does that have to do with recombination? Well, if you've got Legos, recombination is not really hard, right? So if you want to make a statue of David Ortiz, which they did when he retired from the Red Sox last year, out of Legos, a life-size statue of David Ortiz, you can do that, right? And it's the idea that mattered. Somebody came up with the idea of making a life-size statue of David Ortiz, and they could do that without much trouble, right? But what happens if you're in this part of the diagram, in the middle of the diagram, where both the architecture and the modules are changing rapidly? Okay, it's what David Teese would call systemic innovation, right? And this is a little bit Lachmannian already, right? We've got radical change in things. And what I'm arguing is if we're here, losing my microphone. Am I on? Yeah. If we're here, then recombination is not necessarily so easy. And this is the world that Nate Rosenberg thought about, okay? What happens in a world where everything is connected in a complementary way, right? So you've got a chain of production, and if you're going to make an innovation, you've got to change not just one thing. You've got to change lots of different things along the chain of production. I'm going to talk about a case study at the end and sort of try to give you an example of what I mean by this, okay? But this was basically Rosenberg's idea, that the world is really very complex. Things are interdependent, they're complementary. If you've got an idea how to reconnect things, the real hard part is not thinking up the idea. The real hard part is solving all those problems, right? And he says, sometimes, in fact, the idea is pretty obvious. And I'm going to give you an example of that. That the idea itself, the recombinant idea, is pretty obvious. What's hard is getting it to work, because there's all these interdependent things that have to be invented and fixed in order for the whole system to work. Okay, and so Rosenberg talks about bottlenecks. As soon as there's one bottleneck in the system, that will focus our innovation. Right? It's a focusing device, as he calls it. If there's a bottleneck, that bottleneck is a focusing device. Once you solve that bottleneck, break that bottleneck, then another one will crop up because some other part of the system will need to be fixed. And in fact, I think of this as not just Rosenberg. This is all what I tend to think of as the sort of Stanford School of innovation studies, is sort of focus on complementarity. So you think about not just Nate, but Paul David and Gavin Wright talking about how things are complementary. Paul David talking about how hard it was for why the invention of electricity, which I'm going to talk about, didn't generate economic growth as rapidly as you would think because of all of these complementary things that had to be reinvented along the way. People like Tim Bresnahan and Shane Greenstein talking about the same thing with computers, right? Computers took a long time to become productive because there had to be co-invention of a lot of other things that were complementary to computers. Now, of course, before there was a Stanford school, there was an Austrian school. And you don't have to read Lachmann very far to see that he was saying pretty much the same thing, right? Lachmann said everything is problem solving, right? Which is exactly sort of what Rosenberg is saying. All human activity is problem solving. And Lachmann, of course, was also very much into complementarity, okay? And again, I won't read this to you, but this is what we've been talking about at some of the sessions about Lachmann, the uniqueness of capital, its lack of homogeneity, and the importance of complementarity. If there's a difference between sort of Rosenberg's view and Lachmann's view, it's that Rosenberg stresses the idea that of sort of commonality, that everybody's going to see what the problem is, and everybody's going to run to try to solve that problem. Whereas Lachmann tends to say people are going to look at the problem, everybody's going to look at that problem differently, and they're going to solve it. And that's going to actually may lead to a new invention that they hadn't thought of. And I'm going to give you examples of both of those things actually happening, okay? Where in one case, in some aspects, the problem was obvious, and the difficult part was solving all the complementary pieces. And in other cases, in solving the problem, somebody looked at the world differently, right? In fact, for both of the couple of cases, somebody looked at the world differently, and by looking at the world differently, was able to solve the problem, right? So this is sort of my argument. Now I don't know where. Come back to this in a second. I don't know what this has to say about. I mean, if people want to talk about that, we can. Whether this is really an argument that has much to do with top-down versus bottom-up. If Joel here, we could have a discussion. So what's my contribution to this? Well, one of the things that I wanted to add to the discussion is institutions. So, Joel, if you read Lockyer, or what you read, wonderful, wonderful stuff, what you read is how people come up with these ideas, but there are often other people who block them, right? That there are impediments to implementing innovations, and those that may differ across societies, and that might be important for explaining the Industrial Revolution and the great enrichment and so on. What I want to focus on, though, specifically is property rights. And I'm going to make the argument that what's important in systemic innovation, where there are multiple complementary stages that have to be adjusted, is who has the right to change those stages, right? So what matters very often is the structure of decision rights, right? What do I mean by decision rights? I basically mean Oliver Hart, Henry Hansman, right? The residual right to control, to choose an action in situations not specified in the contract, may or may not include residual income claims, depending on how. I mean, that's kind of stuff I've written a lot about, and I don't want to sort of detour there too much, right? And if you've read any of my past stuff, you probably know that one of my hobby horses is this idea of dynamic transaction costs. And the idea of dynamic transaction costs is that we don't want to, we can't always explain the institutions or the organizations we observe as equilibrium outcomes in a kind of functionalist way. We actually have to look at how things actually change. And if you look at how things change, the source of transaction costs might arise from the facts of change themselves, right? So if, for example, you have, and I'm going to talk about this in the case, if you have integrated decision rights, meaning you have control over decisions at every stage in this complicated process, it's probably going to be a lot less costly for you to make the necessary changes than if you control only one stage and you have to negotiate with all the other stages, right? And so that's my theory of vertical integration. It doesn't necessarily have to be complete ownership integration for the story today. In fact, part of the story will be where somebody is given, through contract, is given a set of decision rights. It may not be the ultimate residual claimant, but through contract is given a wide set of decision rights to do what they want. And I've been saying this for a long time, and only recently have I realized that there's a second side to this, and I realized it reading the work of my late friend Steve Klepper on spin-offs, which if you haven't read his stuff, I really recommend it. It's a posthumous book that's come out from Princeton that David Hounshell and others edited. And the point that Steve made is sort of more about, so I'm always talked about integration, but Steve's point is that it's really the same process for differentiation and fission as well, because what he talked about was spin-offs. Okay, so I think about a world where you've got markets, and it might be costly to use markets if you're changing things rapidly, right? Somebody described this as the Foss and Klein theory of the firm. I think they're kind of latecomers to that particular theory of the firm. That if the market, that it might be costly to use markets contracts in a world that's changing very rapidly, it might be better if you have all the decision rights yourself. But what I didn't think about was, what if you start in a world, and I should have, sort of have in other contexts, think what in a world where you've already got integrated decision rights and you've got an ongoing system, but you want to change that system. Well, you might not have the decision rights within the company that's making the thing. And in order to make the differentiation that you want to make, whether it's a product differentiation or a fission or a managerial change or whatever it is, you don't have the decision rights, somebody else does. So what you have to do is you have to spin off in order to get the decision rights. And Steve makes the claim, and other people like Gordon Moore have agreed with this, that explains industrial districts, not agglomeration economies. So one of Steve's theses is that industrial districts are the result of spin-offs. They're not the result of agglomeration economies. So here's my case study. So now I can tell stories. It will be more interesting. Maybe you can see how you apply these ideas. And I want to frame these ideas by telling the story of the Sprague family, mostly of North Adams, Massachusetts, 3 generations of Spragues. Frank Julian Sprague, who lived in the world of the dynamo. I'll tell the story in a minute. His son, Robert Sprague, who was the head of a mid-20th century American company in North Adams, that made passive devices, mostly capacitors. And his nephew and Frank's grandson, Peter Sprague, who was part of the Silicon Valley story. He was the chairman of the board of National Semiconductor. And so what are these stories? So Frank Sprague came from a pretty poor background. I don't know if that's relevant to Joel's story or not. Came from a poor background in Connecticut. His mother died. His father abandoned him, so he was shipped to North Adams to be raised by aunts. But he was a good student, and he was interested in the technology of the day. And he applied. He went down to Springfield to sit for what he thought was the exam for West Point. It turned out to be the exam for Annapolis, so he became a naval officer. And while he was a naval officer, he tinkered, and he'd spend time on the ship drawing diagrams of machinery that he wanted to invent. And he met a lot of people in the electrical business. This was the era, of course, of the dynamo, right? So this was the era. This was the hot technology of the time. The dynamo is basically you spin coils of wire. You spin magnets within coils of wire to generate electric current, but you can reverse that, right? It's perfectly reversible. You can put in electric current and get out mechanical energy. And that was Frank's baby, was the electric motor, okay? And what he invented is, he eventually resigned his commission and went to work for Thomas Edison in Menlo Park. And Thomas Edison assigned him to go work on a substation somewhere that they were setting up. But finally, he persuaded Edison to let him work on the electric motor. And what Sprague invented was basically a feedback system where so that the motor could operate with constant speed under different loads, because they would feed back into the magnet. The electricity would feed back into the magnet to keep the load, the RPMs constant. And of course, that's a perfect solution to the problem of electric traction, which was the big problem in the day, right? So this is a Rosenberg story, right? So this is a problem that everybody saw, right? It was a recombination. So what was the problem? The problem was in American cities, public transportation was mostly horse-drawn carriages, right, which were terrible. They were filthy and smelly, and the horses died, and they were expensive, and they were slow, right? And people said, everybody said, wouldn't it be nice if we could recombine this new electrical technology with things that we know about steam railroads and create an intercity urban system? But nobody could do it. There are all kinds of technological problems that had to be solved to do this, right? And so there was no originality, in a sense, to finding the problem or finding the recombination. And what Sprague did is he lucked into a situation where he had played around with some of this. He did a demonstration in New York. In New York, it was even worse because they were running steam locomotives underground into Grand Central. Can you imagine that? And there was a famous crash where a boiler train crashed into the back of another train, and the boiler was terrible. So people wanted electric railways, and these entrepreneurs went to Richmond, Virginia, of all places, and they were there for some business, and they noticed what a terrible system of horse-drawn transit Richmond, Virginia had. And they said, here's a profit opportunity, all right, Kersnerian profit opportunity, but we don't know anything about the technology. Let's hire somebody who does. So they went to Sprague because they'd heard of him from his tests in New York, and they said, we'll give you a contract, carte blanche. You can do whatever you want. We just want a running system after 18 months or whatever it is, and we want a central power station, 80 motors, and 40 cars. You do it any way you want. We don't care how you do it. You have complete decision rights about how you do this. And Sprague did it. Okay, and he solved all of these problems. And we can think about recombination, right? Is this a modular recombination? Well, people thought about it that way, right? So what's your first instinct if you say, let's combine together elements of the electric technology with elements of the steam locomotive? Well, let's just take the steam boiler out and put an electric motor in, right? And so this is what Edison did. So this is actually an electric train where they took the, right, but they kept everything, right? They even got the cow catcher, right? And it's pulling the cars behind it. And what Sprague realized is that you needed a systemic reinvention of how this was done, right? So what he did is he created the Sprague Truck. These are the Sprague self-adjusting motors, which he had to scale up with gears because it turns out he didn't realize they had 10% grades in Richmond, which he hadn't figured on. So he had to go to Brown and Sharp and make better engines. He had to gear them up. But what he realized is that you don't want to have an engine that's separate from the cars. You want to hang the motors down below next to the wheels in every single car, right? And that was the solution to the problem, and he solved all kinds of other problems and was very successful, right? And as Harold Passer says, this is a little bit Mokerian quotation of all the resistance that Sprague faced, but Passer makes this point, right, that in the end he broke the wall of resistance by securing a foothold in a new firm or one with new management. That is, he had complete decision rights. Right? So that's the first Sprague. He went on to invent other things, including control systems for elevators that then he realized he could also use with electric trains. So it actually was created a modular system where you could put any number of railroad cars on the tracks, and you could and the system would control them. It was really early kind of computer stuff. Frank's son was Robert Sprague, and he grew up in, I guess, where would he have grown up? Mostly in New York, I guess. And he followed in his father's footsteps, right? So he followed in his father's footsteps. He loved technology, and he became a naval officer. So he became a naval officer, and just like his father, he sort of tinkered with ideas while he was out on shipboard duty. And Robert's idea was so if Frank was the era of the dynamo, Robert was the era of the vacuum tube and the radio, which was the hot technology of the early 20th century. And what Robert came up with, the idea he came up with was a tone control for radios, which was basically a switch that would switch among a bunch of different capacitors with different electrical characteristics and change the tone of the radio. And so he and his wife set up shop, and he was stationed at Charlestown, and they were living in Quincy, and they set up on their dining room table and making tone controls, but it turns out nobody wanted tone controls. But his brother, Julian Sprague, who's another of Frank's sons, said, look, don't sell the tone control, sell the capacitors, because you've actually created much better capacitors than anybody's had. So he went into the capacitor business. They tried to outsource them, but nobody could make these capacitors, so they had to integrate vertically into the equipment to make capacitors. And by accident, they needed more space. They couldn't do it out of Quincy anymore. And they wanted to go, they said, well, let's go find there are lots of mill towns here in Massachusetts, let's go find a mill. And by coincidence, they ended up in North Adams, where Frank had grown up. And they bought an old textile mill. This is not the first one they bought. The first one, this is the one that became their headquarters a little bit later, which is the Arnold Print Works on Marshall Street, which was the Sprague Electric Company. And that was a classic mid-20th century American company, okay? They had an R&D lab, and their business model was invention in this R&D lab. So they would invent the next generation of capacitors, right? Here's a better way to make them. Here's a different material. We could use tantalum instead of silicon or whatever. We could wind them in a different way. We could make them for a different application. And the lab would sort of come up with these ideas, but they would have to invent their own production equipment because they were one step ahead of everybody else. So they had to invent the production equipment as well as the capacitors themselves. They struggled in the Depression. They did well in World War II, as you might expect. They did well. They did well during the Cold War, where there was a lot of demand for capacitors. But of course, there was something looming on the horizon in the post-war period, which was the transistor. Now, the transistor was not what does Christensen call it, a destructive innovation for them, because if you had discrete transistors, you still need capacitors, right? So they didn't really care about that, but they saw, like everybody else, their eyes got wide when they saw the transistor, because this was going to be the new thing. And so they, like everybody else, they bought the rights from Bell Labs. Sprague set up in trying to make transistors. They set up a new plant in Worcester that Robert's son John was put in charge of, and they weren't successful. Okay, and this is the story that's sort of typical of American firms in the late 20th century. By the 1970s, the competition from abroad and other places was coming back. They'd been very successful after the war, like most American companies, because there was nobody else to compete with them because they had been bombed during the war. And so for 30 years, 25, 30 years after the war, America had an artificial comparative advantage in manufacturing that wasn't their real comparative advantage. And so everybody was doing really well. But by 1970, you get the Vietnam War inflation, and just about to get the collapse of Bretton Woods caused by the Vietnam War inflation. And the Sprague workers finally affiliated with the national unions, and they went on a big strike in 1970 and walked out, and it shut down production, and their sales plummeted, and Sprague reacted to that like other companies in the U.S. and started shipping all of their production to the South and overseas, right? And North Adams collapsed into depression. Sprague basically went out of business. This is the Arnold Print Works, the Marshall Street plant. Today is the Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art. And they've got a very nice Sol LeWitt exhibit if you're ever up in northwestern Massachusetts. But that was the Sprague. That's what happened to the Sprague plant. And basically they got gobbled up in the diversification wave of the 1970s and 1980s. They were bought up by Penn Central, right, in the conglomerate wave. And then they were pieced out, and some parts of it sort of still exist. Some part of it is still owned by Vichy, but it's basically out of business. So that was and so what's the point here? The point is, it turns out that none of the electronics firms in the United States that were successful and thriving in the vacuum tube era made the transition to the transistor, right? None of them, not RCA, not Philco, right? Not General Electric, nobody, certainly not Sprague. And why is that? Okay, and the answer is that the mid-century model of in-house research and development was not the right model for the transistor. Okay, so what was going on with the transistor? Well, the transistor was actually being developed by spin-offs. So this is the Steve Klepper story. Okay, I'm sure you know the story. William Shockley, who was one of the inventors of the transistor, moved to San Francisco Peninsula, where he'd grown up, and attracted a lot of really good people to come work with him because he was a good teacher and he was a good recruiter. He was a terrible manager and an even worse personality, apparently. So what happened? So what was really happening is that product innovation, was no longer the bottleneck. It was no longer the reverse salient. The Rosenberg problem now was production. It wasn't inventing new things. It was figuring out how to make the transistor more cheaply, make it more durable. And the people who figured out how to do that were these spin-offs ultimately from Shockley. So there was the Traitorous Eight, who included this guy, Jean Erny, who was a Swiss guy, and Bob Noyce and Gordon Moore. Right? These people all spun off, and they got money from a Long Island investor called Sherman Fairchild Venture Capital, and they set up their own company. And as they're trying to figure out these transistors, this guy Jean Erny, again, he was a contrarian, right? And he's just like Sprague saw the truck in the way you reconfigure trains in a different way. Erny said that everybody was telling him, you've got to clean oxide off of the wafer because oxide is bad, right? So everybody was worried about how they're going to clean oxide off of the wafer. And Erny said, I'm going to leave the oxide on the wafer. It turned out that was exactly the right thing to do, right? Because the oxide is actually a very good insulator. And that led to the planar process. It turns out they already had in-house several diffusion processes that they could use once he had that idea. So this is like the Frank Sprague story, but it's a little bit different, right? In the Frank Sprague story, everybody knew what the main chance was. Everybody knew what the problem was, right? Here, everybody knew what the problem was, but they didn't know. I guess they're probably more similar than that, right? They didn't know how to solve the problem. And it turns out that spin-offs like Fairchild were the ones who were good at this, right? Why were they good at it? Because they treated it as a production problem, not as an R&D problem. In fact, Robert Noyce, so Erny created the the planar process, as you know, Bob Noyce then expanded that idea to the integrated circuit. And Bob Noyce's view was, don't do research and development. He had a what he called a policy of minimum knowledge. You learn only when you absolutely have to. So if you come up against a barrier and you can't, a Rosenberg bottleneck, and you can't solve it, well, then call the physicists and let's do some calculations and see what the solid-state physics is. But we're not going to have a lab doing solid-state physics. We're going to learn only when we absolutely have to. And so they hired a guy called Charlie Spork as a production manager, and they ramped up, and they basically used the Henry Ford model. They used Ford pricing, learning curve pricing, and they outcompeted everywhere. They could produce these things much faster and better, cheaper than anybody else at Fairchild. But there was a problem in that Sherman Fairchild was no dummy. He had a buyout option in the contract. So as soon as he saw how successful these guys were, he exercised his buyout option, and he made Fairchild Semiconductor the semiconductor division of his company, which was Fairchild Camera and Instrument. And so now these guys who were owners are now on the payroll. They don't have stock. They're being told what to do by Syosset, right? The headquarters is on Long Island, and they're a conglomerate. They're buying up they're taking the profits from the semiconductor division, and they're buying a lot of stupid things, right? And Charlie Spork comes along. Charlie Spork is this guy, who was the production manager, the genius behind the mass production of semiconductors. He says that Fairchild made their life intolerable, and so what did they do? They all left, right? Famously, Noyce and Moore left to found Intel, which you've probably heard of. Charlie Spork did something else, and that has to do with the third Sprague, who's this guy, Peter. He's the son of Julian. Julian was the guy who suggested they sell the capacitors. Julian died fairly young, and he left a modest inheritance to his son, Peter. And Peter was working in New York. He was trained as an economist, by the way, Peter. And he was working in New York, and somebody told him about this company in Danbury, Connecticut, which was National Semiconductor, which was making semiconductors out of a former hat factory. Danbury was the hat capital, the hat industrial district in Connecticut. And so he bought shares really, 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 really cheap. And because he thought this was a lark, he bought more shares. And then within a couple of years, he had taken the company public, and he became chairman of the board. In fact, he was chairman of the board, non-executive chairman of the board of National Semiconductor for 30 years. So he took the company, this was in the early 60s, he took the company public. And as soon as that happened, the company was public, he gets a knock on the door from Charlie Spork. And Charlie Spork says, Fairchild's making our lives miserable. We want to find some place that will give us complete decision rights, that will let us do our Fairchild thing the way we want to do our Fairchild thing. I'll bring a bunch of really good people from Fairchild with me. We will, but part of the deal is we have complete decision rights. We have carte blanche to do whatever we want, and they hemmed and hawed, but Peter said, yeah, fine, come on board. He fired the old guys. He brought these guys on board. They got rid of, they scaled down production in Danbury. They moved back to Silicon Valley, and they became the cost leader, even more than Intel, the cost leader in making semiconductors. They were the second largest semiconductor manufacturer in the United States after Texas Instruments. They had then bought Fairchild. They ended up buying what was left of Fairchild. And National itself was bought out by Texas Instruments about 5-6 years ago for $6.5 billion. All three Spragues in the pictures were heads of electrical companies at age 27, which is interesting. So this is my story, okay? That decision rights are important. Decision rights are the rights to choose, to take actions in uncertain situations without having to incur the transaction cost of negotiating, all right, bargaining, persuading other people in the chain of production. Sometimes that means something like vertical integration, right? Frank Sprague had unified decision rights Charlie Spork had unified decision rights. They could do whatever they wanted because it was a systemic process. We're going to do it. We're going to do it our way so we can solve the problem. And so it's that vertical integration on the one hand and fission, differentiation, and spin-offs on the other hand are the two sides of dynamic transaction costs.
Thank you very much. Thank you.